Just a couple days ago, GSAP featured this site as their site of the week on Twitter, and it totally deserves it. As you'd expect, it's packed with some seriously slick animations, but what stood out to me was that it wasn't just 2 or 3 effects. The entire site is full of fresh, thoughtful motion concepts that feel genuinely new. One in particular really caught my eye, this amazing marquee transition that flows seamlessly into a horizontal scroll experience. As the marquee element comes into view, the images animate across the screen, but following that, one of them gets pinned in place while the rest slide out, and that single image then expands to fill the viewport and transforms into a full screen intro for a horizontal scroll section. It's such a creative idea, and I don't think I've seen this kind of transition done before, so of course, I had to try rebuilding it. After spending quite a few hours on it, I was able to recreate the core animation using GSAP's ScrollTrigger and Flip plugins. And in this video, I'll walk you through exactly how I rebuilt that effect from scratch. Definitely one of the trickier scroll effects I've worked on, but super fun once it all came together. If you find these kinds of rebuilds helpful, make sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you'd like to access the source code for this project, plus hundreds of other similar micro projects and a brand new website template every month, you can check out the Pro membership via the link in the description. Alright, let's get into the code. First, I'm creating a top level div with the class container. This will wrap all the main sections of the page. Now technically, we could place those sections directly inside the body, but later in the animation, we'll be changing the background color right in the middle of a scroll when the pinned image scales up. So instead of handling background color separately on each section, we'll just apply it to this one container. It keeps everything centralized and a lot easier to manage. Next, I'm adding 2 sections, hero and outro. These aren't doing anything fancy right now. I just want the scroll experience to feel more intentional, so we are giving it a clear start and end. Inside both of these, I'm dropping an h1 tag with some placeholder text. This is just to make sure the layout doesn't feel empty, and it also helps anchor the beginning and ending visually. Then we'll move on to the marquee section. Here, I'm adding a new section with the class marquee. Inside that, I'll place a div called marquee wrapper, and that will have another div called marquee images. So this gives us 3 layers, and each one has a specific role. The outer marquee section acts as the overall container, the marquee wrapper is where we'll apply the slight rotation, and the marquee images is the element we'll animate horizontally as the scroll progresses. The reason we are separating these is to avoid transform conflicts. If you try to animate horizontal movement directly on a rotated element, you'll often end up with unexpected sideways shifts or jittery motion. So I think the easier way is to rotate the wrapper but animate the inner images separately. Now inside marquee images, I am pasting in 13 images, each wrapped in a div with the class marquee image. You can add more or fewer depending on your design, but the sizing will need some adjustment in the CSS. For this version, 13 gives me a nice, balanced layout that loops across the screen smoothly. Also, make sure to add an extra class called pin to the center image. We'll use this specific one later in JavaScript to create a clone and transition it into full screen when the scroll changes from marquee to horizontal. Now let's set up the horizontal scroll section. I am adding a new section with the class horizontal scroll, and inside it, a wrapper div called horizontal scroll wrapper. This wrapper will eventually span 3 full widths of the viewport and will animate it sideways using transforms as the user scrolls vertically down the page. Inside the wrapper, I am creating 3 horizontal slide divs. Each of these is set to 100% viewport width and height, so combined, they make the wrapper 300% wide. The first slide is empty, so I'm giving it an extra class called horizontal spacer. This acts as a buffer between the marquee and the actual scroll content. It gives the pinned image some breathing room before we shift into the horizontal scroll phase. Now in the second and third slides, I am adding real content. Each one will have 2 columns. The first column holds a heading inside an h3, and the second column displays an image. This is the content you'll see once the scroll kicks in. Text on one side, image on the other, both sliding smoothly as a part of the horizontal scroll. That's all we need for the HTML structure. Let's move on to the CSS and start styling it. I am starting with a custom font import for this project. It gives the layout a clean, modern look and fits well with the overall aesthetic. Next, I have set 2 color variables at the root level, one for a light background and one for a dark. We'll use this later to switch between light and dark modes smoothly as part of the scroll transition. Now I'm applying a global reset. This clears out default margins and paddings and makes sure the box model is consistent across all elements. Then I'm setting the font on the body to the custom typeface we just imported. For the images, I am making sure they always fill their containers completely. They'll scale to fit both width and height and stay visually consistent using a cropped cover style. Now I'm defining some basic heading styles. The main heading uses a large size with a tighter line height and slightly reduced letter spacing. The subheadings follow the same styling logic, just scaled down to match their role. Next, I'm styling the container element. It spans the full width and height of the page and holds everything inside. I've also marked it for background color changes since we'll be animating that value during scroll. Now for the hero and outro sections, both are full screen blocks with padding and center text. Inside each of those, the heading is centered and constrained to a readable width. In the outro section, I'm also switching the background and text colors to dark and light. This creates a nice contrast to close out the page, same as the horizontal slides. Moving on to the marquee section, it's half the screen height and hides anything that spills outside. This gives us a clean horizontal scroll strip without overflow issues. Inside that, I am positioning the marquee wrapper right at the center of the screen. Then I'm rotating it slightly to add some visual movement, same as the inspiration side. This is what gives the marquee that subtle tilt. Within the wrapper, we have another inner container that holds all the images. This one is also centered but offset to the left, so the marquee scroll has some room to move across. It's extra wide and uses flex layout to spread the images in a single horizontal row. We have also spaced them out evenly and vertically centered them. I marked this layer for transform animations since this is what will be moving on scroll. Each individual image sits inside its own wrapper. They share equal space and maintain a consistent wide rectangle ratio. Now we'll style the horizontal scroll section. The entire section takes up full screen height and hides any overflow. Inside it, the wrapper is stretched across 3 full viewports in width. We have laid it out using flex, so all the horizontal slides sit next to each other. This wrapper is what will animate sideways as the scroll progresses. Each slide takes up 1 full viewport in width and height. The inner content is spaced apart using padding and gap, and we are using flex layout here too, so the text and images align side by side. For the slides that hold content, we are flipping the background and text colors. That helps separate the horizontal section visually from the rest of the layout. Inside each slide, the left column is given more width to hold text, while the right column holds the image. Both columns are centered and aligned in the middle of the slide. The text and image inside each column are slightly reduced in width and height, so they don't touch the edges. Now, I'll add a few responsive adjustments for smaller screens. At narrower breakpoints, I'm reducing the heading sizes and tightening the spacing. I'm also adjusting the wrapper width in the marquee to give it more space to scroll. This will make the images appear a bit bigger on smaller screens. Then, I'm switching the layout of each slide to a stacked column layout instead of side by side. The text appears below the image and we add extra padding and spacing for balance. The image and heading both stretch to full width and the text is aligned to the top left of the column. That's everything for the CSS. The structure is now fully styled and responsive, and we are ready to wire up the animations next in JavaScript. Alright, before we jump in, just a heads up, to keep the video short and to save myself some editing time, I'll be pasting the code block by block instead of typing it out line by line. the project's a bit longer than usual. So this helps keep things efficient. You can just pause the video if you need to follow along, and even though I'm not writing it line by line, I'll still break down every part of the code and explain exactly what's going on and why we are doing it. So let's get into it. First, we are setting things up by pulling in all the tools we are going to use for this project. We have got GSAP at the core, which we'll use to drive all the animations. Then we bring in ScrollTrigger, that's what lets us sync animations to scroll position, and Flip, which helps us animate layout changes smoothly when elements shift around. We'll use that later for the image transition. We are also importing Lennis. This one just makes the scrolling feel more natural and fluid. Next, I am wrapping all of this inside a load event. This makes sure the page is fully ready before we start animating anything. It's always a good idea to do this, especially when we are dealing with layout-based animations or grabbing elements positions. Now, I'm registering both plugins with GSAP. This is the one-time step to let GSAP know that we plan to use ScrollTrigger and Flip in this project. Then I create a new instance of Lennis. You can find this exact block of code on their official documentation site. Next, I grab our background colors, one light and one dark, straight from the CSS variables. We'll be animating the background between these two colors later when the transition kicks in, so I'm storing them here in variables to make that easier. And finally, I create a little helper function that blends between two colors. This will come in handy later when we are fading the background from light to dark based on scroll progress. Alright, now let's start building the marquee animation that triggers as we scroll. First up, I want that row of images to start off screen and move slightly to the left as we scroll through the marquee section. So to make that happen, we are using GSAP's to method on marquee images and tying it to a scroll trigger. Here is the idea. As soon as the marquee section starts entering the viewport, we start animating the X position of the images from -75% to -50%, which is what we have earlier set inside CSS2. This gives it that slight drifting motion as the marquee scrolls into view, almost like it's sliding past you at an angle. Now the interesting part starts. One of the images inside that marquee, the one with the class pin, needs to behave differently from the rest. Instead of sliding away like the others, we want that one to stay behind, stick to the center, and eventually scale up and transition into the next section. But here is the tricky part. We can't actually pin that image in place because it's part of a container that's moving, so instead we are gonna fake it. And the way we do that is by cloning the original image at the exact moment it comes into view. So we start by declaring two variables, one to store the clone and another to keep track of whether the clone is active or not. Then we define a helper function called createPinnedMarqueeImageClone. Inside this function, we first make sure we don't accidentally create multiple clones. If the clone already exists, we just return early. Next, we grab the original marquee image, the one we want to freeze and transition later. Then we use getBoundingClientRect function to get its position and size on the screen. This gives us coordinates we'll need to place the clone exactly on top of the original. We then create deep copy of the image using cloneNode method, and we store it in pinnedMarqueeImageClone. Now comes the setup. We use GSAP's set method to position this clone above the center of the screen, matching the original image's size and location. We also rotate it slightly by -5 degrees to match the angle of the marquee layout. This way, the user doesn't notice the switch at all. It looks completely seamless. A couple more tweaks here. We set pointer events to none so the clone doesn't block any mouse events, and we'll add will change transform to give the browser a hint that this element is about to animate, which helps with performance. Once the styles are applied, we append the clone directly to the document body. This makes it independent from the scrolling marquee images container, which is exactly what we want, so it can stay fixed in place. And finally, we hide the original image by setting its opacity to 0. At this point, the user is seeing only the clone and they can't tell the difference. To keep things clean, we also define a remove pinned marquee image clone function. This one checks if a clone is active, and if it is, we remove it from the DOM, clear the variable, and restore the original image's opacity. We'll use this later when scrolling back up, so we can reverse the entire effect and reset the layout properly. That's the full setup for the marquee image transition. In the next step, we'll actually pin this clone and transition it into full screen image using GSAP Flip, and that's where it actually starts to get fun. Transitions. First up, we pin the entire horizontal scroll section in place as the user scrolls down. This locks the section to the top of the viewport and holds it there for a custom scroll distance, in this case 5 times the height of the screen. We do this because we want that horizontal movement to feel long and drawn out giving enough space for all our panels to animate across the screen. Next, we create another scroll trigger, this time for the marquee section. This trigger is responsible for handling the pinned image logic we set up earlier. So the moment the user reaches the top of the marquee section, we run the function that clones and pins the image to the center of the screen. And if the user scrolls back up into the marquee again, the same thing happens. But if they scroll back past it upwards, we remove that pinned clone and show the original image back in place. It's a simple switch, just helping us manage whether that floating image should be visible or not, depending on whether the user is. Now comes the flip animation setup. We start by declaring a variable to store the animation instance. Then we set up a new scroll trigger on the same horizontal scroll section, but this one starts a bit later when the section reaches the middle of the screen. As soon as the scroll hits that point, we check a few things. Is the pinned image active? Has the flip animation already been created? If not, we take a snapshot of its current state using Flip's built-in method. Then we right away update its styles. We reset the position so it stretches full screen, remove any rotation, and place it right at the top left corner of the viewport. This gives us the starting point for a nice fluid flip transition. Once that's done, we initialize the flip animation using the saved state, but we don't play it yet. We keep it paused so we can scrub through it manually as the scroll progresses. This will let us control its timing frame by frame with scroll. And finally, we define what should happen when the user scrolls back up past this section. If the flip animation had been initialized, we kill it, clearing out any memory. Then we reset the background color of the container back to light, and we reset the horizontal scroll wrapper's X position back to 0, which basically scrolls everything back to the first light. This setup forms the foundation for a smooth scroll driven transition, pinning the section, controlling the clone visibility, and preparing the flip effect for when the actual scroll animation kicks in. Now let's move on to the main scroll trigger that drives the entire sequence. This one tracks the scroll progress of our horizontal scroll section from the very top of it all the way down. That scroll progress gives us a value between 0 and 1, and we'll use that single number to control everything: background color, flip animation, horizontal scroll, and even the pinned image movement. Let's break it down step by step. First, we are animating the background color. From 0% to 5% scroll, we want the background to fade from light to dark. So we check if our scroll progress is less than or equal to 0.05. That's 5% of the total scroll range. Now we want a smooth transition, so we calculate how far we have scrolled within just this 5% zone. To do that, we divide the current progress by 0.05. For example, if progress is 0.025, we are halfway through this range, so that the calculation gives us 0.5. And that's what we use to interpolate between two colors, so it starts light, gradually darkens, and reaches full dark exactly at the 5% mark. Once we pass 5%, we move into flip animation range. This range from 5% to 20% is where the image transitions from its original marquee position into a full screen version. That's a 15% chunk of scroll. Again, we calculate how far we have scrolled within this specific zone, so we divide the current progress by 0.2, which is 20%, giving us a value that reaches 1 exactly when we hit 20%. We then scrub through the flip animation using this number frame by frame. So instead of letting the animation play on its own, we are syncing it directly to scroll. That gives us precise control and a super smooth image expansion effect. Next up, the main horizontal scroll animation. This kicks in after 20% and runs all the way up to 95%, which gives us a scroll range of 75%. So again, we calculate progress within this section by subtracting 0.2 and then dividing the result by 0.75. Here's the math breakdown. We subtract 0.2 because we want this section to start after the flip animation ends. We divide by 0.75 because 95% minus 20% gives us a 75% span to work with. This gives us a clean value between 0 and 1 for just this zone, and we use that to move the horizontal wrapper. Now, why 66.67%? The reason we are using this precise value is because it controls how far we move the horizontal scroll wrapper. Let's say we have 4 panels inside that wrapper and we are showing one at a time. To scroll through the remaining 3 panels, we need to move the wrapper left by 3 out of 4 panels, which is 75% of its width. But here we are working in percentages relative to the container, and CSS translates are done in full widths. So we are using a slightly smaller numbers for 3 panels, 66.67%, because of how the wrapper is sized. That number ensures we reveal just enough and land perfectly at the last panel by the end of the scroll range. While all that's happening, we also animate the pinned image, but at a slower rate. This one has only 100% width and we want it to move at the exact speed as the wrapper. So we calculate a smaller movement so it looks like it's floating along with the rest of the horizontal slides. We multiply the same progress by a smaller amount, about a third, and apply that as a transform to the pinned image. This creates that entire horizontal sequence where the image moves as the content moves too. Finally, once we scroll beyond 95%, we snap everything into its final state. The flip animation stays at full progress. The pinned image is moved completely off screen using a hard set X position. The wrapper is locked at its final offset. This avoids any last minute jitter or misalignment and ensures the transition feels fully complete. So that was it. Hope you found the video helpful. See you in the next one.